Late at night in a quiet call center, a routine shift takes a terrifying turn. A desperate voice comes through the line. "There's someone inside my house." What begins as a simple call for help spirals into a supernatural nightmare. Flickering, lights, moving shadows, and a chilling whisper. Now it's your turn. Will he survive the horror that awaits? Stay tuned and find out in this gripping story of suspense and terror. The clock on the call center wall ticked steadily, its monotonous rhythm marking the passage of time in a space that felt devoid of life. Guilherme sat slouched at his desk, the faint glow of his monitor highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. It was another long night shift, filled with complaints about overcharged bills, unreliable internet connections, and the occasional bout of verbal abuse from frustrated customers. He sipped from a coffee mug that had been refilled too, many times the bitter liquid doing little to keep his exhaustion at bay. At 27, Guilherme often wondered if this was all life had to offer. The call center was a stepping stone, or at least that's what he had told himself 3 years ago when he first started. Yet here he was, still glued to his headset, dealing with faceless voices that drained him of energy. Outside, the city was quiet. The streets bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. Inside, the hum of computers and the soft clatter of keyboards were the only sounds that filled the room. Guilherme had once dreamed of more, of becoming an engineer, of creating something meaningful. But dreams had a way of fading when faced with the relentless grind of reality. Bills had to be paid, and opportunities seemed always just out of reach. He glanced at the clock again. 23:47. Only 13 minutes until the end of his shift. He sighed, rubbing his temples as he mentally prepared for one last call. The fluorescent light above his desk flickered, casting the room into brief moments of semi-darkness before stabilizing again. He looked up, irritated, but too tired to care. The building was old and maintenance wasn't exactly a priority. The flickering seemed to echo his own state of mind, unstable on the verge of burnout. A sharp beep broke his reverie. Another call. Guilherme straightened in his chair, slipping the headset back over his ears. His voice, though tinged with fatigue, carried the professional detachment he had perfected over the years. "Good evening. This is Guilherme. How can I assist you?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a faint sound, a ragged, uneven breath. He frowned, glancing at the screen. The number was local but unfamiliar. "Hello? Can you hear me?" he prompted, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Yes. I can hear you," a voice finally answered. It was a woman, her tone shaky and barely above a whisper. "Are you all right, ma'am? How can I help you?" Guilherme asked, his fingers hovering over the keyboard to take notes. "I need help," she said, her voice cracking. "There's someone inside my house." The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. Guilherme straightened in his chair, his heart pounding. This wasn't the usual call about a technical issue or billing error. He forced himself to stay calm, his training kicking in. "Okay, ma'am. Are you in a safe location? Can you lock the door where you are?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. I'm in my bedroom," she stammered. "But I can hear him. He's downstairs. And now he's coming up the stairs." The line went quiet except for her ragged breathing. Guilherme's eyes darted to his supervisor, who was engrossed in his own call. He waved frantically, signaling for help, but the older man didn't notice. His mind raced as he considered his next move. "Stay on the line with me," he said, his voice firm. "I'm going to call the police for you right now." Before he could reach for the secondary phone to dial the authorities, the woman let out a choked sob. "He's outside my door," she whispered. Guilherme froze, the weight of her words sinking in. His hand trembled as he pressed the button to place her on hold and dialed the police. He relayed the details of the situation, as quickly as he could, his eyes darting to his monitor where her call remained active. When he returned to her line, there was no response. "Ma'am, are you still there?" he asked, his stomach twisting with dread. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then, a sound, a faint, low whisper. It wasn't the woman. The voice was deeper, rougher, and filled with malice. "Now, it's your turn," it said. Guilherme felt his blood run cold. His headset slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. The fluorescent light above flickered once more, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Last thing he heard before the silence swallowed him was the ringing of his phone. The room was dark, the faint glow of his computer monitor casting strange shadows across the cluttered desk. Guilherme's breathing was shallow as he stared at the phone, its screen glowing faintly with the same unknown number. He hesitated, his hand trembling as it hovered over the receiver. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but some part of him, a mix of duty and morbid curiosity, forced him to pick it up. "Guilherme," the voice rasped, low and deliberate. It sent a chill down his spine, like ice running through his veins. How do you know my name?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The line crackled with static, and for a moment he thought he heard faint laughter, dry and humorless. Then came another voice, faint and desperate, layered beneath the static. "Please, help me." It was her, the woman from before. She sounded weaker now, as though whatever had been after her had drained the life from her. Guilherme gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles white. "I'm trying to help," he said, his voice rising. "The police are on their way, just hold on, stay with me." But the line cut off, leaving him in suffocating silence. Guilherme slammed the receiver down, his chest heaving. He glanced around the call center, desperate for some sense of normalcy. His colleagues were still there, but something about them felt wrong. They moved mechanically, their heads bent low over their desks, faces obscured by shadows. "Raquel?" he called to a coworker who sat a few desks away. She didn't respond. She didn't even look up. He stood and walked over to her, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the quiet space. When he reached her desk, he froze. Her chair was empty. The monitor in front of her blinked, displaying static and distorted images that made his head ache. He stumbled back, his legs weak, and looked around the room again. The desks were empty. Every single one of them. Panic clawed at his chest as he backed away, his eyes darting to the exit. He needed to get out, to leave this place behind. But before he could take another step, the phone at his desk rang again. This time it was louder, sharper, like nails on a chalkboard. He covered his ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate his skull. Reluctantly, he returned to his desk and picked up the receiver, his hand shaking. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice breaking. A long pause followed, and then the guttural voice returned, colder and more menacing than before. "You didn't answer her question, Guilherme. Who will help you?" Before he could respond, the line went dead and the room was plunged into complete darkness. Guilherme stood frozen, the silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He fumbled for his phone, using its weak flashlight to cut through the darkness. The beam illuminated the empty desks and the faint outlines of chairs, but nothing else. He inched toward the exit, his breath shaky and uneven. The fluorescent lights flickered back on suddenly, bathing the room in harsh, unnatural light. Guilherme flinched, shielding his eyes. When he lowered his hand, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the room. It was tall, its body obscured by shadows that seemed to cling to it like a shroud. Its head was tilted, as though it were watching him. "Who's there?" Guilherme called, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a single step forward, the sound of its footfall echoing unnaturally through the room. Guilherme stumbled back, nearly tripping over a chair. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy stapler, and held it out like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The figure took another step, its movements unnervingly slow and deliberate. As it approached, the shadows around it seemed to shift and writhe as though alive. Guilherme's heart pounded in his chest, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his feet refused to move. The phone on his desk rang again, the sound piercing the tense silence. Guilherme's head snapped toward it, his stomach twisting into knots. When he looked back at the figure, it was gone. He spun around, searching the room, but it was empty. The phone continued to ring, its tone sharp and relentless. With shaking hands, he picked up the receiver. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Static greeted him at first, followed by faint whispers. The words were indecipherable, but they carried an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, the woman's voice broke through, clearer this time but filled with despair. "Help me. He's here." "Where are you?" Guilherme asked, his voice urgent. "Tell me where you are and I'll come to you." Her sobs echoed through the line, each one like a dagger to his chest. "He's coming for you too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't stop him." The line went dead and the room fell silent once more. Guilherme dropped the receiver, his hands trembling. He turned toward the exit, determined to leave, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, featureless and cold. A cold breath brushed against the back of his neck and a voice whispered in his ear. "Now it's your turn." The lights flickered again, and the room was plunged into darkness. Guilherme's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in the oppressive silence of the room. The darkness pressed against him, heavy and suffocating. He fumbled with his phone, turning on its flashlight again. The narrow beam illuminated, little more than a few feet ahead, the shadows dancing ominously around him. The call center, once a mundane space of keyboards and fluorescent lights, had become something alien, something alive. As he moved toward where the door should have been, he caught a glimpse of movement in the glass partition of the conference room. He stopped abruptly, his breath hitching. A shadow moved across the glass, slow and deliberate. It was tall, impossibly so, its shape indistinct but menacing. Guilherme took a step back, his phone shaking in his hand. The shadow stopped, as if sensing his fear, and then tilted its head toward him. It wasn't a trick of the light. There was intent in its movement, a cruel intelligence that made his skin crawl. "Who are you?" he shouted, his voice trembling. The sound echoed in the empty space, but there was no response. The shadow moved again, this time closer to the edge of the glass. Guilherme's legs felt like they were made of lead, his instincts screaming at him to run, but he couldn't look away. Then, without warning, the glass shattered. The noise was deafening, the shards exploding outward as if something had forced its way through. Guilherme ducked, shielding his face with his arms. When he looked up, the room was silent once more, the shards of glass glinting faintly in the dim light of his phone. But the shadow was gone. He stumbled backward, his breathing ragged, and turned toward the desks. They stretched endlessly now, row after row, disappearing into the darkness like a maze. He couldn't tell if the space had always been this large, or if the building itself was changing around him. The phone on his desk rang again. The sound was sharp and grating, like nails scraping against metal. Guilherme turned to look, his pulse racing. The screen of the phone glowed faintly, displaying no number, just a blank, pulsating light. Reluctantly, he answered. "Hello?" The voice, on the other end, was deep, distorted, and mocking. "You saw it, didn't you? You saw me." Guilherme clenched the receiver tightly. "What do you want from me? Why are you doing this?" There was a low chuckle, guttural and chilling. "Because you answered." The line went dead again, leaving Guilherme in the suffocating quiet. His knees buckled and he sank into the nearest chair, his mind racing. He glanced toward the shattered conference room glass, half expecting the shadow to reappear. But it didn't. Instead, the air around him grew colder. His breath misted in the faint glow of his phone, and the faint sound of whispers began to fill the room. At first they were distant, like voices carried on the wind, but they grew louder, closer, until it felt like they were surrounding him. He covered his ears, but it did little to block out the sound. The whispers were inside his head, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. And then, just as suddenly, As they had started, they stopped. In the deafening silence that followed, Guilherme heard a faint sound. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere deep within the endless rows of desks. He stood, his legs shaky, and turned toward the sound. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He gripped his phone tightly, the weak beam of light shaking as he tried to steady his hand. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then from somewhere in the darkness the voice returned, soft and mocking. "You're not alone, Guilherme, not anymore." The oppressive atmosphere of the call center grew thicker with each passing moment. Guilherme clutched his phone like a lifeline, the weak beam of light casting fleeting glimpses of the endless rows of desks. He was trapped in this labyrinth, a prisoner of a place that no longer obeyed the laws of reality. He moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the vast empty space. Every shadow seemed alive, shifting and writhing at the edges of his vision. He tried to focus, to find a way out, but his mind kept replaying the voice's mocking words. "You're not alone. Think, Guilherme. Think," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. He forced himself to take slow, deep breaths, but the sense of being watched never left him. As he passed one of the desks, he noticed something strange. A telephone sat there, its receiver off the hook, the cord swinging gently as if it had just been placed down. He stopped, staring at it. There was no reason for anyone else to be here. His colleagues had disappeared, hadn't they? A sudden movement caught his eye. The monitor on the desk blinked to life, its screen displaying static. Guilherme stepped closer, compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity. Amid the static, faint images began to form, distorted faces, hands reaching out, and what looked like himself. He stumbled back, his heart racing. The image of his own face stared back at him from the screen, distorted and twisted in agony. The monitor flickered and the image changed. Now it showed a phone, a familiar one, his desk phone. It was ringing. The sound pierced the silence, sharp and insistent. He turned toward his desk, which seemed impossibly far away now, its outline barely visible in the darkness. The phone continued to ring, the tone warped and distorted as though mocking him. Guilherme hesitated, every instinct telling him not to answer. But the ringing grew louder, more insistent, until it was unbearable. Gritting his teeth, he ran toward the desk, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When he reached the phone, he hesitated for only a moment before picking it up. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. The line crackled with static, and then the voice returned, colder and more menacing than before. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" "Understand what?" Guilherme demanded, his fear giving way to anger. "What do you want from me?" The voice laughed, a chilling sound that made his skin crawl. "It's not about what I want, Guilherme. It's about what you deserve." Before he could respond, the line went dead again and the phone fell silent. Guilherme slammed the receiver down, his chest heaving. As he turned away from the desk, he froze. The shadow was back, standing at the edge of the room. This time, it wasn't alone. The shadow loomed at the edge of the room, taller and more menacing than before. But what truly froze Guilherme in place was the realization that it wasn't alone. Behind it, smaller, indistinct figures began to emerge from the darkness, their outlines flickering like faulty projections. They moved erratically, their forms distorting as though they struggled to exist in this reality. Guilherme's breath quickened, and his legs felt rooted to the spot. The figures didn't come closer. They simply stood there, watching. Or perhaps, waiting. He turned his flashlight toward them, the weak beam barely illuminating the space. The light seemed to warp around the figures, as if repelled by their presence. "I don't understand," Guilherme whispered to himself, his voice trembling. "Why me?" The shadows didn't answer, but the silence around him grew oppressive. It was as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Then, without warning, a voice echoed through the space. not from the shadows, but from within his own mind. "You know why, Guilherme," it said, deep and resonant, as though it had been pulled from the depths of his memory. He staggered backward, clutching his head. The voice was familiar yet distorted, like an old recording warped by time. As the words echoed in his mind, fragments of memories began to surface. Fragments he had buried long ago. He was 10 years old again, standing in the dimly lit hallway of his childhood home. His mother's voice echoed from the kitchen, sharp and frantic as she argued with someone on the phone. Guilherme peeked around the corner, his small hands gripping the wall. He didn't understand the words, but he could feel the tension, the fear in her tone. "Stay in your room," she had told him later that night, her face pale and drawn. "No matter what you hear, don't come out." But he hadn't listened. The sound of breaking glass and muffled screams had pulled him from his bed, his curiosity outweighing his fear. He had crept down the stairs, his small feet silent on the wooden steps. What he saw at the bottom haunted him for years, a dark figure indistinct and impossibly tall standing over his mother. The memory blurred, fragmented. He didn't remember what happened next, only that he woke up in a hospital bed days later. His mother was gone, and no one believed his story about the figure. The police had called it a break-in gone wrong, but Guilherme had always known there was more to it. Now, standing in the eerie stillness of the call center, those buried memories resurfaced with brutal clarity. The shadows, the voice, the sense of being watched, it all felt painfully familiar. "You've seen us before," the voice said, interrupting his thoughts. "And you called for help back then too, but no one came, did they?" Guilherme clenched his fists, his fear giving way to anger. "What do you want from me?" he shouted into the darkness. The shadows shifted, their forms undulating like smoke caught in an invisible wind. The larger figure stepped forward, its presence dominating the room. "We want what you owe," it said, its voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. "Owe?" Guilherme repeated, his voice shaking. "I don't owe you anything." The figure tilted its head almost mockingly. "You survived when she didn't. Do you think that was by chance?" The words hit him like a blow, and he stumbled back, his mind racing. He wanted to deny it, to shout that they were wrong, but a part of him couldn't ignore the weight of those words. The lights above flickered, casting disjointed shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. The smaller figures began to close in, their distorted forms growing more defined as they approached. Guilherme backed away, his mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. "Wait," he shouted, his voice cracking. "If this is about what happened, that night I didn't have a choice. I was just a kid." The figures paused, their movements halting as though his words had given them pause. The larger shadow loomed closer, its form towering over him. "You're not a child anymore, Guilherme," it said, its voice quieter now, almost mocking. "But you still make the same mistake. You called for help. And help always comes too late." Before Guilherme could respond, the shadow extended a hand, or what resembled one. The darkness seemed to stretch toward him, tendrils of shadow curling through the air like smoke. He tried to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. The shadows engulfed him, and for a moment, everything went black. When Guilherme opened his eyes, he was no longer in the call center. He stood in a void, a space of endless darkness punctuated by faint, flickering lights. The air was thick, oppressive, and carried a faint metallic tang. He turned in a slow circle, searching for anything familiar, but the void stretched endlessly in every direction. The shadowy figure stood before him, its form more defined now. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a swirling mass of darkness, devoid of features. "You've been given a choice," the figure said, its voice resonating through the void. "What choice?" Guilherme asked, his voice hoarse. The figure gestured, and the void around them shifted. Scenes from his life played out in the darkness. His mother's face, her desperate pleas that night, the call center and the faceless voices he dealt with every night. the woman from the phone call, her voice trembling with fear. You can stop it, the figure said, but it will cost you. Stop what? Guilherme demanded, his frustration mounting. The cycle, the figure replied. You've been marked since that night. The calls, the shadows, they will never end unless you face what you fear most. Guilherme's mind raced. The idea of being trapped in this nightmare forever was unbearable, but the thought of facing the entity that had haunted him for so long was equally terrifying. What do I have to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure extended its hand again, the darkness around it swirling ominously. You know the answer, it said. Give what was taken, or take it back yourself. Guilherme stared at the outstretched hand, his mind a whirlwind of fear and determination. He didn't fully understand what the figure meant, but he knew one thing. This was his only chance to end the nightmare. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached out to meet the shadows. The moment Guilherme's hand met the shadows, the void around him collapsed. Darkness rushed inward, pulling him into a vortex of memories and sensations so vivid they felt real. He wasn't standing anymore. He was falling, plummeting through a tunnel of flickering images and distorted voices. His screams were swallowed by the cacophony, and then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. Guilherme found himself standing in his childhood home. The air smelled of damp wood and faint traces of his mother's perfume. The walls were exactly as he remembered them, adorned with faded photographs of smiling faces that now seemed frozen in time. Everything felt smaller than it had in his memories, but the weight of the past pressed on him like a physical force. The shadow stood in the hallway, its form no longer towering and menacing but human-like, as if it had taken on a shape more familiar to him. Do you understand now? It asked, its voice softer but still resonating with power. I don't understand anything, Guilherme snapped, his voice raw with frustration. You keep saying I owe something, but I didn't do anything that night. I was just a kid. The shadow tilted its head as if considering his words. You called for help, but help doesn't come without a cost. Guilherme clenched his fists. I didn't ask for this. Whatever you are, whatever this is, it's not my fault. The shadow raised a hand, and the scene around him shifted. He was no longer in his childhood home, but in the call center, though it wasn't the same. The room was warped, the walls bending inward like a living thing. The rows of desks were piled haphazardly, and the fluorescent lights flickered with a sickly, unnatural glow. At the center of the room was the woman from the call. She sat at a desk, her head bowed, her hands clutching the receiver as if it were her lifeline. Guilherme approached cautiously, his heart racing. Ma'am? He called, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. As he got closer, he saw that her face was pale, almost translucent, her features blurred like a smudged painting. When she finally raised her head, her eyes locked onto his with a look of profound sadness. You didn't help me, she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Guilherme shook his head. I tried, I called the police, but they didn't come in time, she interrupted, her tone filled with quiet resignation. Just like before. Her words cut deep, and the memory of his mother's voice echoed in his mind. Stay in your room. No matter what you hear, don't come out. He staggered back, the weight of the parallel between the two events crashing down on him. The shadow appeared beside the woman, its form towering once more. You've spent your life running from this truth, it said. The guilt you carry, the choices you made, they've brought you here. I didn't have a choice, Guilherme shouted, his voice breaking. I was scared, I was just a kid. And now you're not, the shadow replied, its voice cold and unyielding. Now you have the power to make a different choice. The woman stood, her blurred form becoming clearer. You can't save everyone, she said softly, her tone almost gentle, but you can face what you've been running from. Guilherme's breathing quickened. What do you want me to do? The shadow extended its hand again. This time, the void around them seemed to ripple, the walls of the call center bending and twisting as if in anticipation. Give yourself, it said. End the cycle. Guilherme hesitated. The meaning of the shadow's words was clear: sacrifice. If he gave himself over, perhaps this torment would end. But fear gripped him. He didn't want to die. I can't, he whispered, his voice trembling. The shadow's form seemed to swell, its darkness enveloping the room. Then the cycle continues, it said, its tone heavy with finality. The room shook violently, the warped desks and flickering lights giving way to complete chaos. Guilherme fell to his knees, clutching his head as the voices returned, louder and more dissonant than before. They spoke in a language he couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear: condemnation, judgment, and inevitability. The shadow loomed over him, its form pulsating like a living void. You must choose, Guilherme, it said. There is no escape. Through the cacophony, Guilherme thought of his mother. He thought of the nights he spent blaming himself for her death, for not doing more, for not being braver. He thought of the woman from the call and how he had failed her too. The weight of his guilt was unbearable, but beneath it all, a spark of defiance ignited. No, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He forced himself to his feet, his gaze locked on the shadow. I won't let you control me, I won't run anymore. The shadow paused, its form flickering. You think you can defy me? It said, its voice laced with disbelief. I don't know if I can, Guilherme admitted, but I'm not afraid of you anymore. The air around him shifted, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. The woman's form began to fade, her expression softening. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The shadow roared, its form twisting and writhing as if in pain. The room around them began to collapse, the walls crumbling into darkness. Guilherme stood his ground, his fist clenched as the shadow's presence grew weaker. You can't escape what you are, the shadow hissed, its voice fading. Maybe not, Guilherme replied, but I can choose who I want to be. With a final deafening roar, the shadow dissolved into nothingness and the room was consumed by light. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Share this video with your friends so they can experience the suspense too, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling content. See you in the next one.